that okay? So it's going to start now.
Okay to start.
Yeah, I've got to put the screen up. I forgot about that bit. Just hold on for a second.
So they're just putting up the illustrations. And here we are. We have them.
Ready now?
Okay. There's if come choin chinkama.
So is everybody hearing both me and or Donald?
Yes, no.
Yes.
Okay, ma.
So I'm happy to be with you, and a good evening or a good morning to you all. Some are listening from Australia. It's an honour for me tonight to talk to you. And as Alison said, I'm in Tiree at the moment. I'm looking out the window over to Call, and it's a lovely evening here. Hope it's just as lovely where you are as well. So let's start now with the talk. The ground officers and factors in Gaelic oral tradition in Tiree and Muile. Amongst the tales and the songs that we have in Gaelic oral tradition in Tiree and in Muile, some deal closely with the ground officers and the factors in Tiree and Muile who kept control over the Duke of Argyll's estates. They have a particular connection to the unrest between these officers and the crofters and the cotters in the 19th century. The reason behind many a story and a song was how heavy-handed they were on the people. The stories and the songs are notable because the estate officers usually appear as laughingstocks or weak people, rather than the strict dominant people which they really were, in their own view anyway, under the Duke's authority. They're portrayed in the references as bad people, as enemies, and at times as creatures who have some sort of connection with the evil supernatural world, or to Satan himself. On the other hand, the crofters and the cotters are represented as heroes, and they get the upper hand over the factor or the officer very often by some trick or other. Neither those stories nor the songs are history at all, or at least history in the sense that we can rely on what they tell us about contemporary events. They're not intended to be a true remembering of them, nor of the people who created them. There may well be mention in them of factors and officers who were actually in Tiree or Muile, but the setting in which they appear in the stories or the poems is not always correct nor authentic. But on the other hand, there's a good measure of truth in them, if we accept them as evidence of how people felt at the time they were created, and of the desire they felt to defeat the enemies who were oppressing them. I well remember many years ago listening to Dr. Arnold Bruford giving a talk to a conference in which he called this sort of story factor fiction. There's many a laugh I had at Dr. Bruford's wit. Factor fiction aims at the heart of the matter. These are stories about the factors and the officers which are based on some sort of fact, allegedly, a fact as small as the name of a factor, but which is created like fiction fiction or a story from imagination to give confidence and status to the people who relate it. Sometimes there are pretty obvious historical mistakes in such stories, as we'll see shortly. We'll have a look at the stories and the songs, and we'll start with the stories. The stories, then. It's not only in Tiree and Muile alone that these stories can be found. They appear in some other areas where the factors and officers used physical force against the people, or where the people felt they were receiving bad treatment from them. We have one or two examples from Sutherland, and many is an example from other islands. Some of these stories would move from area to area. And we'll start with a story which was recorded in Barra, though it can be found in various places. When I used to teach a foundation Gaelic class in Edinburgh, I used to read this story with the class. And the name of it was The Night It Rained Porridge. The night it rained porridge, then. There was an old woman once in one of the islands, and she was behind with the rent. And she was afraid if the factor came that he would evict her from the house. She had a son as well, but he wasn't totally compos mentis. Anyway, she got word that the factor was coming to collect the rent on such and such a night, and she thought of a trick. She had a gun in the house, and she gave the gun to the boy, and she said to him, "You away out, and when you see the factor coming, fire a shot at him, and you kill him." When the lad went out, the Gaidhlig cooked a pot of porridge. She set off with the pot, and she climbed a tree, and she sat on a branch, and she started to chuck the porridge all over the place. Whilst the porridge was firing out of the sky, and the lad was being splattered by it, who appeared but the factor? The lad raised the gun, he aimed it at the factor, and he killed the factor. And he buried his body. Now the old woman avoided him, but on the way home, she lifted the factor's body and put a sheep's carcass in its place. When the lad reached the house, he told his mother what he had done. But, he said, it was a strange night anyway. It was raining porridge. And he showed the Gaidhlig how he was, covered in porridge. Anyway, after a while, men came looking for the factor. And they didn't know what had happened to him, and they asked, "Do you know what happened to the factor?" And the boy answered, "I killed the factor. I killed him the night it was raining porridge." Now this astonished the men. And then the boy left with the men, and he let them see where he had buried the factor. The men set to digging up the grave, but there was no sign of the factor's body. What they found was a sheep's carcass. "Ach," said the men, "this boy's off his head. He never killed the factor at all." And neither the factor nor the men ever bothered the old woman again. Although this story wasn't told in Tiree or Muile, as far as I know, it highlights for us the sort of references we can find in the other islands. It's a bit like a cartoon in various pictures. It's humorous and lively, and there are three main points in it, which appear as a pattern in our tales. Firstly, In the first place, the rent is worrying the old woman. In the second place, she wants to kill the factor. And in the third place, there's a hero in the story who brings the old woman's wish to fruition and kills the factor. Though such a thing never happened in Gaelic Scotland. I'll turn now to Tiree, and we'll look at the first story we have. Island House is cursed. As we saw in The Night It Rained Porridge, there are the three things I mentioned in the story. The Chamberlain, that's the factor, is terribly hard on one crofter, and the crofter wants to kill him. And the crofter fulfills his wish by using another power. That's by cursing the Chamberlain and the house he's building. Here's the story. It's part of the reading for Tiree, the book. When the house which stands there now was being built, with a causeway between the house and the edge of the loch, MacLaren, the Duke's Chamberlain, ordered the crofters to help with the work. There was one particular crofter working hard for long hours, but when the working day was over, the factor ordered him to keep going. He knew full well that if he refused, that he would be cleared out of his house immediately, and so he kept on working. But he said to MacLaren, "You will never spend a night in Tiree, the house of the island." That's what happened. Just when it was about finished, he became ill. In the hope of defying the crofter's words, he made his servants carry him in a blanket to Tiree. But he died before he got over the threshold. This story is great as a story, but it's not at all reliable as history. It wasn't the Chamberlain MacLaren, or the factor MacLaren as he was called, who built Tiree. That house was built in 1748, when Archibald Campbell of Barnacary was factor in Tiree, and Callum MacLaren didn't come to Tiree as a factor till 1801. MacLaren did indeed live in Tiree, but he wasn't the one who built it. Okay, and we'll think about MacLaren in some of the other stories. But because the factors of the Duke lived in Tiree, the Tiree people had no great love for it. And I have to confess that I never went near it myself. I suspect that a great deal of the Tiree people had or have the same feeling over and above myself. Not only did the house represent the power of the factors, but there were stories about the crofters who were late in paying their rent and who were hanged near the house at Bach na Croichig, the gallows bank, or Bach na Crochi, the hanging bank on the Big Macher. Though the story about Bach na Croichig, the gallows bank, was closely connected to the Duke of Argyll's factors in my day, the same sort of tale was told about the MacLeans in Tiree before the Campbells took possession of the island. Here you have the story telling about a hanging which happened in the time of the MacLeans. Another tale can be found from the era when the island was under the control of the MacLeans. Apparently, the barbaric custom was that the last man to pay his rent would be hanged. This time, this poor man was the miller's son from Bàillidhean, Milton. He was seized and hanged on a hill called Bàillidhean, the hanging bank. When the miller's daughter heard that her brother had been seized, she ran to plead for his life, but she was too late to save him. One of the local poets made a verse to preserve the memory of the miller's son's sad end. O son of the man from Bàillidhean, who had a kiln and grain and a mill, at the Bach you received no respect. That's the story that gives, that mentions the hanging that happened at the time of the MacLeans. The story moved to be a story about the Campbells. Now, a Shenachie and Tiree, a storyteller, historian, Echan Kennedy, had a story about the way this custom was ended. He told the story to Margaret Mackay in 1974. According to Echan, it was a man called Gillespie Lodger, strong Gillespie, from Avonjach, Moss, who put an end to the hanging. Here's the story as Echan told it in Gaelic. Gillespie Lodger and the factor. Once upon a time in this island, the last person that would go into Tiriodh with the rent money, he was hanged on Bach in a Croichu, the gallows bank in the Big Macher in front of Tiriodh. And this time, there was a man in Killimalloic they called Gillespie Lodger, strong Archie, and he and his neighbour went to pay the rent. And he was the one who was in front of his neighbour going to Tiriodh. And he noticed the factor going across the park. And he noticed another man going across. And Gillespie Lodger said to his neighbour, Donald McKinnon, go in. I'm going out in a message of my own. And you go in while I'm away. You go in last. When it was you who was ahead of me coming here. Ah, that doesn't matter, said Gillespie Lodger. You go in. And the man went in. And the factor asked him where MacLean was, that he didn't come in first, that he had come to the place first. No, he went away in a message of his own, he said. He asked me to go in while he was away. Anyway, the factor took the rent money from the other man, and Gillespie Lodger came in then. The other fellow went out. The factor said to him, you're at last paying your rent now. I am. Why didn't you come in? You came to the place first. I did, but I had to go on business of my own, so I couldn't come in. Well, you know what's going to happen to you since you're the last. Yes, said Gillespie Lodger, I'm not altogether unaware of that. But he jumped to his feet and he caught the factor by the throat and he said, you'll be away before me. And the factor begged for forgiveness and that it would be all right and there wouldn't be a word about it. Well, said Gillespie Lodger, if I hear a breath of it, you wait, he said. I'll catch you by the throat, he said, and I'll choke you as surely as I let you go, though I get the gallows afterwards. You'll be ahead of me. And that's how an end was put to hanging in Tiree. Wasn't it awful, the hanging, eh? Now, that's a story about hanging. And that's very non-spiritual, very earthly. But the stories about the factors and the ground officers sometimes appear as if they sit on the threshold between the natural world and the supernatural world. We already mentioned the factor MacLaren, and he, in particular amongst the Tiree factors, was considered as a man who had dark powers. To the Campbells of Barcaldine on the Argyll mainland, and it's clear that he spent a time in Edinburgh University studying medicine. According to Dr. John Hollery, who's with us tonight, who's had a close look at the references and the letters he wrote about the Campbells' illnesses, he was a good doctor. We don't know why he chose to be a factor in Tiree, but perhaps he needed a job where he would get a suitable salary. He left Tiree in 1811 and he returned to medicine in Oban. He wasn't liked in Tiree though, especially at the west end of the island, and a story about him survived that emphasises the dark side of him. And this is how Dol Hallam Ban, Donald Sinclair, had it. And he was talking in English. He used to have a black book. Aye, MacLaren was the name. And when he opened this black book, he had a hoop of steel put round his head, and he could find out anything at all. One of his men got a big pole on the beach, and he was very proud of this pole. It could make a mast in his smack, and the pole was stolen. Well, he opened the book, the factor, and he told my great-grandfather, a man called Black, to go to such and such a place, and you'll find my pole there. And he did. So there you have it. The factor's MacLaren. Why do you think there was a bit of black magic connected with MacLaren? Was it because he was so fond of books and so educated? I don't know. That's a story in which there's a measure of black magic. But here's one about witchcraft, the witches and the clay body. I was talking and giving you a story or two about the factors, but what about the Muile, the ground officers? Usually, people didn't have much love for the ground officers, since it was they who kept a beady eye on what was going on in the communities and reported everything to the factor. They were also closer by class to the people, and some regarded them as spies. One of these was Lachlan Maoir, who belonged to the Ross of Mull. Maoir had a shop, and he was a ground officer for the factor. People hated Maoir so much that we have a story which tells that two witches in Beul-aithris made a corp crea, a clay body of him. They used to put pins in a corp crea, intending that that would bring about the death of the bad person, sort of voodoo. According to Dol Hallam Ban, that was the last clay body that was made in Tiree, and a farmer of island stock came across the witches when they were making the corp crea. The farmer was Ian Mach Alistair Og, Ian, young Alistair's son, who had a big farm in Cornick, one of the MacLeans. He was on the way to the Folklore when he came across the witches. He grabbed the clay body and he smashed it to pieces. Dol Chalampan knew Ian MacAllister Roig and one of the witches, and he praised Ian MacAllister Roig highly for what he did. This is how he told part of the tale in Gaelic. Well, there were him and his cousin going with the herd this day. His cousin was going to see them on board in the boats along with him at Scarinish. And he went up and he saw the old woman and he recognised them. And he spoke to them and he broke the clay body. And he said to them, "Now," he said, "if I hear of anything like that ever again, I'll have you," he said. "And you know what will be done to you? You'll be burnt." Well, never before nor after did I hear of a cork crea being made in Tiree. This is how Donald put it when he was telling the story in English. "But old MacLean made smithereens of it, a hardy old bother. There's not his like on the Isle of Tiree nowadays. He was not scared of anything." Unusually, this story, as it were, criticises the crofters and sides with the big farmers, but such as Ian MacAllister Roig. But the reason for that is the corp crea, the clay body. And the heart of the matter is that it was criticising witchcraft or black magic that was now condemned by the church. We'll turn now to the songs. As I said, we've got stories about the factors and the ground officers, but we have songs as well about the factors and about the ground officers. And we'll start with a little about the Bàillidhean, the black factor, who was in Tiree and Muile. We can take the ferry over to Muile and have a look at a song or two from that island, which relates to a factor who was in Tiree. These poems are more direct than the stories. There aren't so many twists and turns in them. And usually they deal with one event rather than one or two events. Satires are common, poems or songs which criticise the factor or the ground officer, or laugh at him, or both. We have a really good example of that type, which gives a good kick to one factor who had a really bad name amongst the Tiree folk. That was Ian Campbell, or Bàillidhean, the black factor, as some of the Tiree people called him. This factor belonged to Arstford in Islay, and he had a farm in Arstfiannic in the Ross of Muile. In Muile, they called him Factor Maoir, the big factor. The Campbell got the position of factor in Muile and in Tiree at the time of the potato famine, and it was in 1846. And it was he who oversaw the thinning of the population, or as some would say, the clearances, which were done at the time, sending people out of the island. He and the Maoir of the ground officer he had in Muile, Angus McNiven, gained notoriety, which lasted till the end of the last century, to the end of the 20th century, when I was in the Ross of Muile. Right at the end of the 20th century, there was still talking about this man. Maybe they're still talk about them yet. McNiven was from Islay as well, and the Ross of Muile people accused Campbell of giving land to his own Isle friends. I well remember when I was in the Ross of Mull myself, 30 years ago, listening to Johnny Campbell, Johnny Callan, reciting a verse about McNiven that was still alive in tradition. Big Angus McNiven, the heckler of the land. What would cheer me up would be him lying in Killichoman. Killichoman is a graveyard in Islay, so the poet is wishing that McNiven would die. And as he said, Hokag Shin Meanjin, that would cheer me up. Now, he's saying that he and I were looking at this word Heckler, Heckler in Gaelic, and it means somebody who stirs up trouble. So we think it's the English word heckler as in the translation. But heckle was actually connected with the flax work. They had to hit the flax. But also in Dundee, it was used amongst people who were working there that were really keen on a trouble, on a punch up maybe. So it must have come into Gaelic. So I was just reading the verse again in Gaelic. We don't know who made that verse, but we know that there was a man called Hugh Rose in the Ross of Mull, made a satire on the factor, Ian Campbell, when he died in 1872 at the age of 70. I'm not aware whether there are other satires of that sort, which was made when a bad factor died, though satires were made about factors who were still alive, such as Patrick Seller, that was in Sutherland. Apparently, the big factor put Hugh Rose out of his croft, and Hugh wasn't sad at all when he heard that Campbell had died. He was quite happy, and according to the song, the other Mull folk were delighted as well, and they went drinking in their joy. Rose painted a poisonous picture of the big factor in hell, or the black factor as he was called in Tiree, and Angus McNiven along with him. Here's the song. And Eric Cregeen got it from Donald Morrison in the Ross of Mull. There's news in the land that makes us happy to hear it. The factor stretch out without a stitch but a death shot, unable to speak or practice reading or writing. The Isleman's patron lies prostrate with no prospect of rising. When they go to the boat, we'll have a laugh that's hearty. When we gather together, we'll drink toasts to each other with good Highland whisky, with strong wine and cider, without any more worries, since that beast was sent packing. The factor will be foremost in the pit owned by Satan, and Big Angus right behind with a flame of fire at his buttocks, because of all your oppression of women and children, and the folk of this land that you drove over the ocean. When they heard in Canada that that beast was unconscious, bonfires were lit and banners fastened to branches. Their joy was then boundless. As folk met one another, they all fell on their knees and praised God that you'd snuffed it. So, Tiree black factor. There were other little snippets about the death of Factor Ian Campbell. It was reported that he died with maggots eating his body, and that the maggots were pouring out of him to the extent that hens had to be put in his oxers and round about him. We know from the official report of his death that there's not a word of truth in that story, and that it was a weak heart that caused it. The same story was told about another landlord or two in Gàidhlig, and the same story is found of King Herod's death in the New Testament. There was fun and games around the Factor's coffin as well. He was a big man and his coffin was heavy. According to tradition, somebody who was carrying the coffin to the boat said, "He was heavy on us when he was living, and he's heavy on us now." And somebody else said, when they were trying to cover over the Factor's coffin on board the boat on a wet day, with rain falling in the coffin, "Let him have his fill of it, he's hot enough." You can understand where he was. Now, Bàillidhean, we called him the Black Factor, Ian Campbell, in Tiree, but if we turn to a song, a poem, that the Factor's own circle made, we've got the White Factor in Bàillidhean. He's not at all black. Now, these other points of views that were kinder, as he would, but not the ones that the Mulcrofters had. But these weren't certainly not the views amongst the Crofters themselves, but amongst the Factor's own family. So the two sorts of views aren't at all similar. They both arise from a certain circle of acquaintance with the same person, the Crofters on the one hand, and the Toffs on the other. Now, the one point of view doesn't go against the other, though, nor negates the other. It may be said that they're both true or false, because neither one nor the other is complete. Perhaps if we could put together the 2 points of view, or every point of view there is, we would aim to get a good measure of the truth. There was good and bad in Black Ian Campbell, depending on your dealings with him. The warm, friendly side of him can be seen in a song his wife, Florrie, made praising him. Flora McNeil, when she was anxious about him drowning when he was travelling between Muile and Tiree and other islands on estate business. She praises him a lot. She says, "You are mighty as a factor, gaining commendation from Argyll, whereas one who could fill your place with your knack of dealing without treachery." Another view altogether. Now, what about the poetic songs which praise Ian Campbell? We have at least one song like that, a song which was published in 1868 in a pamphlet. It was a man by the name of Ian MacDougall who made this song, and it's told that the Factor gave the poet £5 to make the poem about him. MacDougall lived in Argyll and latterly in Maoir. According to MacDougall, Ian Campbell was a really generous person, and he showed compassion to the people at the time of the potato famine by, instead of being hard on them, by giving them meal, oatmeal, which he transported over from Ireland by his own boat. When the potato withered and not a sliver stayed, you gave them maintenance and everything they wished. You have had blessing and prosperity since you arrived from Ireland, and had you not come over, thousands lacking food would be in a plight. With your brave and clever crew and your rare and splendid ship, you brought meal across from Ireland and then dispensed it on credit. There you have a picture that's different of Black Ian Campbell, and apparently it's true that he did take meal across from Ireland. In the same way, we have poetic songs which praise the odd ground officer who was in Tiree, and one of them in particular laments Neil MacLean, the Moor Ban, the fair-haired officer from Kirkapul, who was drowned off the coast of Coolis, where Donald is just now, in 1809. So the Moor Ban was from Kirkapul, and he went to Islay in a boat with two boys, McDonald's from Coolis, who were related to myself, and their boat went on the rocks down at Nastuachgan near Milton in Coolis. And the bard of the Laird of Coll, Ian MacLean, mentions the people that were drowned, and he tells about the fair-haired officer that he was a really decent man, and he was right in everything he did. He was good at reading and writing, and he was sensible in his dealings with the crofters, and that's great praise. In my opinion, that's the only song we have that actually praises a ground officer. But look at the difference between what happened to the Bàillidhean, for example. But the Moor Ban, Neil MacLean got really praised. He got respect from Ian MacLean, the bard of the Laird of Coll. The songs and the stories about the factors and the officers in Gaelic oral tradition in Tiree and Muile are part of a wider heritage to be found in various regions of Gaeldom. They raise questions in our mind about the sources which they give us and about truth and lie. They're not a detailed history at all, but a way of expressing strong emotions and letting the folk who suffered from oppression gain the upper hand. We could say that they are real lies or truthful lies, if you can imagine that. According to the name Fact or Fiction, by which Alan Bruford christened them, there is fact in them and there is fiction in them. They're true and false at the same time. They give us a view inside the crofters' and the cotters' minds at a difficult time in their lives. They wanted the factors and the officers dead, but not one factor nor officer was ever killed in reality by crofters and cotters. But some of them were killed in the stories, and according to the songs, there used to be great rejoicing when they died. Apparently, it gave comfort to people to think that they had imaginary power like that. a bit like a comic or a cartoon in our own day, or a novel. As we saw with the Black Factor, those stories and songs were totally different from the views their own families had of the factors and the officers. In the eyes of their own families, and sometimes in the eyes of the poets who belonged to those circles, they were blameless. As the proverb in Gaelic says, "A da hoof ir a bhúil." There are two sides to the headland. And apparently there were two sides to the officer and the factor as well. Thanks, everybody. We can consider that and discuss that now.